Friends, welcome to another edition of the podcast Talking NW Synod. I'm Lawrence Heath-Moore, and this afternoon I have with me two guests, Niall Cooper from the Church Action on Poverty and Mike Hart, Transformation Director of the Northwestern Synod, and we're talking about the new campaign, Let's End Poverty, and Northwestern Synod's involvement in it. Welcome, both of you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Niall, if I can start by asking you, you're the Chief Executive of Church Action on Poverty, so what does your job involve, and particularly how does it impinge on this campaign?
So my job is to run the organisation. We're a smallish national charity based in the Northwest. In fact, we're based about 100 metres from Synod office.
You are indeed.
I've had a long way to come this afternoon. And yeah, our role as an organisation is to work with churches, communities and people themselves struggling against poverty to come up with lasting solutions, long-term solutions.
So we'll be talking in a few minutes about how Northwestern Synod sees this as part of our mission, and you see this as part of your role and work. So we'll come to that in a few minutes. But let's start by asking Niall about the campaign, Let's End Poverty. Where did it come from, Niall?
Let's End Poverty came from a conversation originally initiated by the Joint Public Issues team, which is obviously the United Reformed Church, the Methodist Church, Baptist Church, Church of Scotland, launched an open letter with church leaders a few months ago about the cost of living crisis. And they were surprised about the level of engagement and enthusiasm from across a whole different range of organisations and denominations for the issue and for wanting to work together. It was originally just a one-off open letter saying this is that the cost of living crisis is something churches and politicians need to take seriously, but then developed into a conversation about what can we do on the longer term together that would raise the profile of the issue.
Right, because it's a huge issue and it affects everyone, and a lot of the political discussion is very quiet on the matter. Is that fair?
Sadly, I think it is fair, and I think it's deeply concerning that what we know on the ground in communities that we're working in, that many of the churches that we connect with are in, that poverty is a daily reality and a growing reality for increasing numbers of people. We're talking about people who have to make daily decisions about going without basics, food, heating, any level of social enjoyment. And this is having long-term consequences.
Right.
And yet, as you said, if you look at what the topical issues are in political debate, it doesn't seem to be featuring. For me and for many other people, and opinion polls confirm this would be top of many people's priorities. And that seems to be lacking from political debate.
Right. So I'm assuming that what you're trying to do is to get the issue of poverty into the manifestos of the major political parties?
So the time to actually get the issue into the manifestos is past. All the political parties have now written their manifestos. They're all ready for whenever the election's called, even though It might not be for another 12 months. But we still have an opportunity. The election is probably months away, could be up to a year away, to turn some heads. Not just of the political leaders, but of people that are wanting to stand to be elected as our representatives locally in our own constituencies across the Northwest. What level of priority do they give to poverty?
Yeah.
We would say then they should take poverty seriously. They should prioritise it, irrespective of what their party position might be.
Mm-hmm.
That they personally, when they get to Westminster, the day after the election, If we got across the country 100 or 150 MPs that said tackling poverty is one of my top 3 priorities, that would make a huge difference. But for that to happen, that's where the challenge comes back to us, in our own churches, in our own communities, to make clear that this is a priority for us.
That's great. So how do you see that what is the campaign asking churches to do?
The dream, and a dream is one thing, is that every church, everywhere, had that conversation with the politicians that want to be elected at the next general election. So turning it around from a candidate's point of view, if a candidate was asked by 15, 20, 25 churches in their constituency to come and talk about where they see poverty on their list of priorities, that would hugely impact on them. They would start to see this is an issue, well, I wasn't going to take it seriously, but now I am, because I can see so many people in my constituency are also taking this seriously.
The United Reformed Church is not a big denomination,
no.
But across the Northwest, we have, over 3,500 members in our churches. Very few other charities or voluntary sector organisations have anything like that sort of membership. And equally, in our individual local communities, the church is still seen as something which has a status and a position and an authority in a way that means it can act as and should act as a voice for those who would otherwise not have a voice, and give those opportunities to those who wouldn't otherwise have had a voice, to raise these sort of issues that are fundamental about human dignity.
Yeah, and that's the mustard seed stuff, isn't it?
Absolutely,
to bring these voices that are unheard.
Yeah.
Changes things. It transforms things. Okay, this question for both of you. Beyond churches being groups of nice people who are sort of gentle and kind and caring, what are the kind of things that for you, theological convictions, things about faith, things about the content of the gospel, how do these connect with this particular campaign?
I think there are two really important starting points. One is to go back to the creation stories in Genesis and the idea that all humankind is created in the image of God, and therefore we should be according everybody with the appropriate dignity. The second is the stories from the Gospels, from the prophets, about the importance of justice and fairness. The story of the sheep and the goats at the Last Judgment is about what did we do for the hungry, for the thirsty, for the stranger. There are a number of starting points, but those for me are two really important ones.
For me, actually, it comes back to what's the gospel. The gospel is good news, and good news for the poor. The Church of Scotland, more than a decade ago, said it's going to prioritise its work with people on the margins because this is the gospel priority. In a different context, the late Bishop of Liverpool, David Shepherd, wrote the book Bias to the Poor. That if you read the Gospels in the right way, or in the way that they're intended, then there is a clear bias to the poor. It's about putting priority on the poorest, the most vulnerable in society. And I see that in the work that churches do on the ground, in our social action. I went to Cheadlehume 2 or 3 weeks ago, Sunday morning, affluent part of Stockport, but the food bank collection point was there. So even in what we used to think as the affluent parts of the Northwest, there is poverty, and churches are responding on a level of compassion. But the gospel demand is also about justice. And that's where the obligation to speak truth to power is just as important as preaching the gospel. And this is what the 5 marks of mission are about. the transforming the unjust structures of society.
Mm.
And we're not talking about getting on the barricades here. We're not talking about being angry, although there are plenty of things that it's probably good to be angry about.
Yes.
We're talking about holding politicians accountable.
Right.
These are politicians. We live in a democracy. These are politicians who are standing for election to represent us in Parliament. Now, if we don't engage with them, then we've got no right to complain when they don't take us seriously.
That view of politicians is quite refreshing. You're seeing them as part of the solution and part of the community rather than them at Westminster.
I think there's been a very toxic way in which politics has been portrayed. Almost every politician, they do it out of wanting to do good in society, obviously from different perspectives, and that's actually the joy of politics.
Mm.
But there are politicians in every political party, of every political persuasion, that have a passion and a desire to do the best for their community.
Yeah.
And this is about bringing them into the conversation to say, yes, if we are going to end poverty or make any progress towards ending poverty in this country, we all have to be part of the conversation. We all have to be part of that solution. And we need to work with our politicians.
And to give them the opportunities to have the direct conversations with people who have lived experience, who are not naturally a group of people that their normal hectic schedules would bring them into contact with. And that's there's a brokering role here that churches can play in terms of using their networks, using where they're engaged in social action work, in terms of providing those opportunities for that dialogue across that divide.
I think it's the thing I'm worried about. So if I'm a local church and I sign up and I decide my role is to broker a conversation, a public conversation with candidates, I know that if I held a meeting and invited my current MP and the others who are standing in the election, it would be a meeting that we might not be throwing brickbats at the politicians. They'd sit there and throw brickbats at each other, and it would be about political point scoring. So how do we broker a very different kind of conversation, Neil?
So the three things I'd say is don't invite all the candidates at the same time, because they will feel they have to score points off each other.
Mm.
Invite each candidate separately so you can have a one-to-one conversation. You don't need to do it in public. In private, they will be much more able to be themselves. It can be an intimate conversation over breakfast. If quite often a Friday morning is a good time, have a breakfast meeting with your candidate. So that's number one. Number two, try and bring into that space the lived experience, the actual reality of what poverty is. Our experience from work at Church Action on Poverty is that there are always people that are willing to talk about, in fact, not willing, desperate to talk about their experience and what they see as wrong in the world that they would like to see different. Not just as a story, but their hopes and aspirations as a human being for themselves, their family, their community. Finding those people is sometimes a challenge, but they're always there. I can guarantee in any food bank, in any food pantry, in any community centre, warm hub, most people will shy away from talking about it, but there will be one or two people who sat around a cup of coffee. They're the people that will endlessly talk about it because it's passion for them. Bring them into the conversation.
Yeah.
This is not an abstract issue. This is people's lives and stories. And even if you can't find the people, even if they're reluctant to come, record their conversation, record their story, record their words in their own words, and bring that into the meeting.
Yes.
So that the conversation is genuine and real and authentic about what do you as a candidate want to do for Sophie.
Yeah, so Sophie becomes the means of entry into recognising not only Sophie has a problem, but there's a systemic problem here. It's the compassion, justice.
And that this requires a different level of response.
Yes.
Yes. And again, it's not just expecting the politician to solve the problem.
Yeah.
That's part of the problem. That we just project all our worries and life problems and global crisis, that this bunch of 650 people is going to solve everything. They need to be part of the solution, but we need to have a much more adult conversation.
Let's talk about the Northwestern Synod now and our involvement as a synod in this campaign. Mike, you've done a lot of work on the levels of deprivation in the synod and where deprivation is in relation to our churches. Tell us something about what you've discovered.
Over a third of our churches sit in the 10% most deprived areas in this country.
Really?
So it has a disproportionate impact in our synod area. And let's be clear, firstly, that is not to say that there aren't really important issues of poverty and deprivation in the areas that every single one of our churches serves. But there are specific areas where the needs are at a much higher level.
Yeah.
And some of that reflects the thinking that Niall Cooper talked about in terms of the Church of Scotland made 10 years ago. I think the other important thing is that those 30-odd churches that we're talking about are not geographically concentrated. They include our most northerly church, our most westerly church, almost our most southerly churches. They're in urban areas, they're by the sea, they're in rural areas. So it's a reality in all parts of our synod area. And if we're going to be a church in the community, then we have to take a focus and an action where we are on that.
I imagine that most of the listeners will be surprised to hear that statistic. So there are two questions that occur to me. The first is, do our churches reflect that same economic profile that's there in their communities? So are our churches in the poorest communities typically filled with members who are among the poorest?
I think our churches, like any other organisation of the size they are, have a reflect of the variety of their community. I think there are also churches that have got a lot further down the path of working very closely with the most disadvantaged in the area around where they are, which experience has shown has changed the demographic profile of their church to become often younger and often less affluent than perhaps the traditional URC church. Neil talked about the 5 marks of mission and compassion and justice. I was once told that compassion and justice are two sides of a single coin. So actually you haven't got a complete coin if you aren't practicing both. And I think, often as churches we are very good at doing the compassionate, practical things on a day-to-day basis. We're less happy, less confident about how we do the speaking justice, speaking truth to power side of that.
Right.
And I think where the Let's End Poverty campaign and Synod's involvement in it fits with our developing anti-poverty strategy is about how we, in the immediate next 12 months as we run up to a general election, help and support and enable churches to do some of that speaking truth and that justice side of this, about creating long-term solutions to the challenge of poverty in our communities.
Can I also answer the question in the sense that when I think of the church, as a URC member, when I think of the churches I know, not just on a Sunday morning, but the total activity across the week, virtually every church connects with people that are struggling and on the margins. They may or may not be there on a Sunday morning, although I suspect in most congregations they are, even if they're in a minority. And what we're talking about with Let's End Poverty is building a social movement, even if there isn't any connection of the congregation on a Sunday morning with lived experience and reality of poverty. In any community now, there are other organisations that the church may be partnering with, members of the congregation may be volunteering with, that you can get into a conversation about what collectively can we do as part of Let's End Poverty.
Right.
One church can say to the 5 other churches in the town, to the food bank, to how many other organisations, can we all do something over the next few months as part of Let's End Poverty? Can we all have conversations with our candidate? And not necessarily all together. If each of us in turn invited the candidate to come, so the candidate had to come to 10, 15 different conversations where each time it's what are you going to do to end poverty, that would actually really shift the thinking of any politician. And I think that's the role that churches can play.
Yeah.
And that for me is the excitement about the campaign. And the URC is involved, the Methodists, the Baptists, 3 denominations for starters.
Yeah.
But if each of our churches then reaches out to the other churches locally, then that's where we start to build what's quite a powerful movement.
Yeah. So my second question, given that the people who are most invisible and whose voices are largely absent are the people who are most difficult to find, what can the Synod do to help churches discover and engage?
I think there are things that we can do in terms of the training and skilling of local churches. I think there's a lot in what Niall's just said about churches understanding who they as a church and their individual members are already working with. This is about using the connections that you've already got, just in terms of the understanding of churches' neighbourhoods. The Synod's already said it will support churches doing community audits, and there's a lot that churches already know about their communities, to be honest with you.
Tell me what you mean by your phrase, churches are not in decline, they are transforming.
It's very easy to get depressed by the headlines about the decline of Christianity. Actually, we have massive amount of social capital in our churches that we have a real opportunity here to use for the good of our community and in service of the gospel, rather than focusing on a decline in numbers.
Thank you both for your time. Thank you both for all that you're doing. I grew up in a church in Zimbabwe, and we had a Southern Baptist missionary who, when listening to stories like this, would say, "Honey, may the Lord bless you real good." And I find myself wanting to say, the Lord bless you real good in what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence.